By the second night, the wind shifted inland and carried with it the low hum of traffic from Interstate 5, a reminder that the world beyond the gates had not paused, had not lowered its flag, had not felt the weight pressing down on this strip of concrete and steel. Ghost heard every sound. His ears flicked at the distant engines, at the metallic clank of a loose halyard against a flagpole, at the soft murmur of two corporals whispering near the hangar door. But his body remained anchored, paws aligned with the edge of the casket, nose lifted just enough to catch the faint scent of polished wood and folded cotton. He knew that scent. It clung to ceremonies, to final formations, to the kind of silence that follows a name spoken for the last time. Captain Michael Turner had first met Ghost 5 years earlier at a training range just north of the base, on a morning thick with fog and jet fuel. The handlers had lined the dogs up in a row, each one disciplined, alert, waiting for assignment. Ghost had not waited. He had broken formation, trotted straight past two candidates, and stopped at Michael's boots. He did not bark. He simply sat, looking up as if recognizing something already decided. Michael had crouched then, removing his glove, letting the dog take in his scent. "All right," he had said quietly, a smile pulling at one corner of his mouth. "Guess you chose." From that day forward, they moved like a single unit. Early runs along the perimeter at 0530, breath visible in the cool coastal air. Long hours on the range, where commands were short and precise and trust was built not with words, but with repetition. Michael was tall, broad-shouldered, steady in the way he carried himself, with light brown hair cut close and blue eyes that rarely revealed more than necessary. Ghost learned the rhythm of his stride, the subtle shift in tone that meant hold, the softer one that meant safe. On deployment, they shared a cot space separated by less than 3 feet. Michael would rest one hand on the edge of Ghost's crate before turning in each night, a quiet ritual, a wordless confirmation. "I am here." Ghost would exhale, settling his chin on his paws, knowing the shape of that promise. Back at the hangar, a staff sergeant stepped forward and placed a small metal bowl beside Ghost once more. The water inside reflected the overhead lights like a trembling mirror. Ghost lowered his head slightly, not to drink, but to breathe in the air around the casket again, as if searching for the faintest trace of the man who had once knelt in front of him and said, "We go together." The Marines on watch exchanged a look they did not need to voice. This was not confusion. This was not fear. This was memory standing guard. The third morning broke clear and sharp, sunlight spilling across the flight line in long golden bands that cut through the lingering mist. The Pacific lay calm beyond the bluffs, a sheet of pale blue stretching to the horizon, indifferent and endless. Ghost had not shifted more than a few inches since the previous evening. Fine dust had settled along his back, catching in the dark ridge of his fur. His muscles trembled now and then, not from weakness but from the strain of holding still for so long. A captain from logistics approached quietly, removing his cover as he stepped within a respectful distance. He studied the dog, then the casket, then the sky. "He has not accepted it," he said under his breath. But acceptance was not what held Ghost there. It was something else. 2 months earlier, beneath a sky far from California, Michael had knelt beside him on a stretch of open ground where the air smelled of sand and sun-warmed metal. The mission had ended sooner than expected. The extraction point had shifted by less than a mile, but in that kind of landscape a mile could feel like an ocean. Michael had unclipped Ghost's lead and rested his forehead briefly against the dog's. "Stay close," he had murmured. Not an order, a promise. They moved together across uneven terrain, boots and paws finding rhythm in each other's pace. When the wind changed direction, Ghost felt it first. When Michael adjusted course, Ghost was already there. There had been a moment, brief and suspended, when the sky overhead turned the color of ash and the air seemed to press inward. The helicopter had arrived through that haze, blades slicing the silence into measured pulses. Ghost had leapt first, turning back only when Michael's hand pressed firmly against his shoulder. "Go," Michael had said, voice steady despite the urgency beneath it. Ghost obeyed. He always obeyed. The aircraft lifted within minutes. From the open ramp, Ghost had watched the ground shrink away, his body straining forward against the handler who held him back. He had not seen Michael board. Back in the hangar, a gust of wind slipped beneath the edge of the flag once more, lifting it just enough to reveal the polished wood beneath before it settled again. Ghost's nostrils flared. He searched for the scent that had guided him through 5 years of sunrises and long marches. It was not there. Around him, Marines rotated in quiet formation, white gloves crisp against dark uniforms. A bugle rested on a folding chair nearby, untouched for now. The ceremony would begin soon. Ghost finally moved, but only to rise slowly to his feet. His legs stiff, his posture deliberate. He stepped closer until his nose hovered inches from the casket's edge. He did not whine. He did not paw. He simply stood, eyes fixed forward, as if waiting for one more command carried on the wind. The chaplain stepped forward as the sun climbed higher, its light warming the steel beams above and casting a steady glow across the assembled formation. Rows of Marines stood at attention, dress blues sharp and unmoving, ribbons catching the morning light. The air carried the clean scent of pressed fabric and ocean wind. Ghost remained inches from the casket, his body rigid, every line of him aligned with something unseen. The command to begin was given softly, almost swallowed by the open space of the hangar. A prayer followed, measured and calm, words about service and sacrifice drifting upward into the rafters. Ghost did not bow his head, but his ears lowered slightly, as if recognizing the cadence of reverence. A memory surfaced in him not as an image but as a feeling. A small chapel on base the year before deployment, sunlight filtering through narrow windows. Michael seated in the back row with one hand resting against Ghost's shoulder. He had never been a loud man in prayer. He sat quietly, eyes forward, fingers brushing absently through the fur at the base of Ghost's neck. "Whatever happens," he had whispered once, so softly no one else could hear, "you stay steady." The bugler now lifted the instrument to his lips. The first notes rose clear and thin, stretching across the flight line like a line drawn in air. The sound was not loud, but it carried. It reached the edges of the base, the empty tarmac, the distant water. Ghost's chest expanded as if the music had entered him. He did not flinch. He did not look away. Each note seemed to land between his ribs, steady and deliberate. As the final tone faded, the honor guard stepped forward in perfect unison. White gloves moved with precise care, lifting the folded flag from the casket. The fabric caught the light once more before being drawn into crisp, exact triangles. Ghost watched every motion, his gaze following the flag as if tracing a path only he understood. When the final fold was completed, a senior officer accepted it with both hands and turned toward the family gathered nearby. Michael's parents stood side by side, their expressions composed but lined with grief too deep for words. The officer spoke gently, presenting the flag with honor and gratitude. The wind shifted again, brushing across Ghost's coat. For the first time in 3 days, he stepped back exactly one pace. Not in retreat, but in alignment. His posture straightened further, shoulders squared, head high. A handler moved as if to guide him away, but paused when Ghost did something no one had trained him to do. He lifted his right front paw slowly, holding it just above the ground, his body still as stone. It was not a trick. It was not confusion. It was deliberate. The hangar fell into a silence deeper than before. Ghost held the pose, eyes fixed beyond the casket now, beyond the formation, toward the distant line where ocean met sky. Ghost held his paw suspended for several long seconds, muscles steady despite the strain, eyes fixed on that thin line of blue where the Pacific met the sky. The gesture was small, almost fragile, yet it carried a weight that settled over every Marine in the hangar. No one had taught him to do that. No one had rehearsed this moment. The handler who stood a few yards behind him felt his throat tighten and lowered his own gaze, as if witnessing something sacred. When Ghost finally placed his paw back on the concrete, it was slow and controlled, not a collapse, but a completion. The ceremony moved forward with quiet dignity. The casket was lifted, 6 pairs of white gloves gripping polished handles in perfect unison. Boots struck the floor in measured cadence as they carried it toward the waiting vehicle outside. Sunlight flooded in from the open hangar doors, bright and almost blinding after the shade within. Ghost turned and followed, not pulling, not straining, simply matching the pace step for step. The wind outside was stronger, carrying the scent of salt water and distant eucalyptus. As the vehicle doors closed and the formation dissolved into smaller clusters of subdued conversation, Ghost stopped once more. The engine started. The sound vibrated through the pavement beneath his paws. For a brief instant, he leaned forward, ears pricked, as if expecting that familiar voice to call him back into position. It did not come. The vehicle rolled away down the long stretch of road that cut through the base, shrinking against the bright California morning. Ghost watched until it disappeared from sight. Only then did his shoulders lower slightly, the rigid line of his back easing for the first time in days. His handler approached carefully and knelt beside him. "All right, buddy," he whispered, voice rough but gentle. Ghost did not resist when a hand rested against his neck. He stood there, breathing in the empty space the vehicle had left behind. The base resumed its rhythm around them. A transport plane roared overhead. A group of recruits jogged past in cadence, their voices strong and synchronized. Life continued, as it always does. Yet something had shifted. Ghost turned his head slowly toward the ocean once more. The water glimmered under the rising sun, endless and bright. He took one step in that direction, then another, until he stood at the edge of the bluff overlooking the wide expanse below. The breeze lifted the fur along his spine. He sat again, posture straight but no longer rigid, and gazed out at the horizon. There was no command now, no leash, no formation to hold. Only the wind and the open sky. After a long while, he exhaled deeply, a steady breath that carried both memory and release. Then, for the first time since the chopper had landed 3 days earlier, Ghost lowered himself to the ground, resting his chin gently on his paws, eyes still turned toward the place where sea met sky, as if standing watch in a way only he understood. The afternoon. Lights softened as the sun began its slow descent, turning the surface of the Pacific into ripples of gold and pale fire. Ghost remained on the bluff long after the vehicle had disappeared, the sounds of the base settling into a distant murmur behind him. Gulls drifted overhead, their cries thin and sharp against the open sky. The breeze carried the scent of salt and sun-warmed grass, brushing gently through the sable fur along his back. His breathing had evened now, steady and deep, no longer held tight by ceremony or expectation. He lifted his head slightly when he heard familiar footsteps approach across the gravel path. It was the handler again, moving slower this time, no urgency in his stride. He stopped a few feet away and lowered himself onto the grass beside the dog without speaking. For a long moment they both faced the horizon in silence. The ocean stretched for miles, endless and calm, as if it had always known how to hold secrets. Ghost's ears twitched at the distant crash of waves against the rocks below. In his memory, another shoreline surfaced, years earlier, when Michael had brought him here during a rare weekend of leave. They had stood in this same place at dawn, the sky painted in pale pink and blue, Michael's boots planted firmly in the sand. He had removed Ghost's leash and pointed toward the water with a quiet grin. "Go on," he had said, voice light in a way it rarely was during duty. Ghost had sprinted along the surf, paws kicking up arcs of foam, turning back every few yards to make sure Michael was still there. He always was. The handler reached out now and rested his hand gently against Ghost's shoulder. "He would not want you alone," he murmured, barely louder than the wind. Ghost did not flinch. He leaned subtly into the touch, acknowledging it without surrendering the space he still held inside. Down below, the tide shifted, pulling back from the shore before rolling forward again in a patient rhythm. The world kept breathing. The bass loudspeaker crackled faintly in the distance, announcing evening colors. Somewhere a door slammed. Somewhere else laughter broke through, brief and bright. Life, even here, refused to stop. Ghost slowly pushed himself upright. He stood tall against the fading light, gaze fixed one last time on the meeting of sea and sky. There was no figure returning across the sand, no silhouette rising from the waterline. Only the horizon, wide and unbroken. After a quiet pause, he turned back toward the path that led to the barracks and the long road beyond. His steps were measured, not hurried, but no longer frozen in vigil. As he walked beside his handler, the wind followed at his back, lifting the fur along his spine like a gentle hand guiding him forward. He did not look over his shoulder again. The watch had changed. The promise remained. The days that followed did not pause for grief. Morning reveille still echoed across the barracks at 0600. Trucks still rolled across the motor pool in steady lines. Orders were given. Boots struck pavement in cadence. Yet something quieter moved through the base now. Something felt more than spoken. Ghost adjusted to the new rhythm without protest. He reported each morning to K9 Command, posture steady, eyes alert, responding to familiar voices and signals with disciplined precision. But those who worked closest to him noticed the difference. He no longer searched the doorway at every shift change. He no longer angled his body toward a voice that would not return. Instead, he held his focus forward, as if carrying a memory inside rather than looking for it outside. One afternoon, a young corporal approached the training field holding a fresh leash and a tentative expression. He had been assigned as Ghost's new handler, a transfer from another unit, boots still stiff, uniform pressed too perfectly. He stopped several feet away and knelt slowly, offering his hand palm up, the way he had been taught. Ghost studied him without hostility, without eagerness. The breeze lifted dust along the range, carrying the faint scent of gun oil and sun-baked earth. The corporal spoke softly. "I know I am not him." The words hung in the air, simple and honest. Ghost stepped forward and inhaled the unfamiliar scent. There was no spark of recognition, no immediate bond forged by shared history. But there was steadiness. The corporal did not rush. He did not tug. He waited. After a long pause, Ghost sat. It was not surrender. It was acknowledgement. Training resumed gradually. Short drills at first, measured commands spoken clearly and without strain. Ghost responded with the same intelligence that had defined him from the beginning. His gait remained confident. His ears caught subtle shifts in tone. When the corporal faltered, Ghost corrected course with quiet instinct. In the evenings, when the lights softened and the Pacific breeze cooled the air, they walked the perimeter road overlooking the ocean. The corporal did not try to fill the silence. He let it breathe. One night, they stopped at the bluff where Ghost had kept vigil days earlier. The horizon stretched wide and dark beneath a sky scattered with stars. The corporal removed his cover and stood beside the dog without speaking. Ghost sat, posture straight, eyes fixed on the distant line where sea met sky. The wind moved gently through his fur. After a moment, the corporal raised his hand in a crisp salute toward the horizon. He held it there, not for ceremony, not for protocol, but in quiet respect. Ghost remained seated, gaze unwavering. The ocean answered only with the steady rhythm of waves against rock. When the corporal lowered his hand, Ghost stood and turned back toward the base lights glowing softly in the distance. This time, when he walked, his stride matched the young Marine at his side. The past did not vanish. It did not need to. It moved with him, steady as the tide, carried not as a weight but as a promise kept. Autumn arrived quietly along the California coast, softening the edges of summer and cooling the early mornings with a thin layer of mist that clung to the training fields. Ghost moved through those mornings with renewed steadiness, his stride confident, his focus sharp. The young corporal at his side had grown into his role, commands now carrying a calm certainty that matched the dog's disciplined pace. They worked the range together under a sky the color of pale steel, running drills that required precision and patience. Ghost responded without hesitation, muscles flowing beneath his sable coat, ears tuned to every inflection in the corporal's voice. There was no rush in him now, no restless searching of doorways or distant vehicles. There was purpose. Word of his vigil had spread quietly across the base and beyond. New recruits sometimes paused at the edge of the field, whispering about the dog who had stood 3 days beside a fallen Marine. They did not stare long. Something in Ghost's posture discouraged spectacle. He carried himself not as a symbol, but as a soldier still in service. One crisp evening, as the sun lowered toward the ocean and painted the sky in streaks of amber and violet, the corporal led Ghost once more to the bluff overlooking the water. The wind moved steadily off the Pacific, cool and clean. The base behind them hummed with its usual rhythm, lights flickering on in orderly rows as dusk settled in. They stopped at the same spot where weeks earlier Ghost had kept his silent watch. The corporal unclipped the leash but did not issue a command. Ghost stepped forward on his own, standing at the edge with his body aligned toward the horizon. For a moment he remained still, eyes fixed on that endless meeting of sea and sky. The air felt different now, lighter somehow, as if the wind itself carried less weight. The corporal stood a few feet behind him, hands at his sides, offering space rather than direction. Slowly, deliberately, Ghost lifted his head higher. The last rays of sunlight caught in his amber eyes, turning them briefly to gold. He did not raise his paw this time. He did not hold a pose. Instead, he lowered his body into a calm sit, steady and composed. The ocean rolled below in a patient rhythm, waves rising and falling with timeless grace. After a long, quiet pause, Ghost turned away from the water and walked back toward the corporal without looking back. His stride was even, measured, sure. The corporal met him halfway and rested a firm, respectful hand against his shoulder. Together they began the walk back toward the lights of the base, boots and paws striking gravel in quiet harmony. Behind them, the horizon remained wide and unbroken, holding its silence. Ahead of them, the path was clear, and in the steady rhythm of their steps, something unspoken settled into place, not as an ending, but as a continuation carried forward beneath the same vast American sky. Winter settled in gently along the coast, not with snow, but with longer shadows and colder dawns that painted the sky in pale silver before the sun climbed over the hills. Ghost moved through those mornings with the quiet confidence of a veteran who had learned that duty does not end when one chapter closes. His new handler rose before 0500 each day, boots laced carefully, uniform straight, meeting Ghost. Outside the barracks where the air carried the scent of salt and eucalyptus. They began their runs along the perimeter road overlooking the Pacific, breath visible in the crisp air, their pace steady and synchronized. There was no need for many commands now. A glance was enough. A subtle shift of posture was enough. Trust had grown, not rushed, but earned step by deliberate step. On the anniversary of that final ceremony, the base gathered again at the hangar, not for mourning but for remembrance. A small plaque had been placed near the edge of the flight line, engraved with Captain Michael Turner's name and the years he had served. It did not speak of how he left, only of how he lived. Marines stood in respectful formation as the commanding officer spoke briefly about loyalty, about courage measured not only in action but in constancy. Ghost sat at the front, posture aligned, ears forward, the morning light reflecting softly in his amber eyes. When the moment of silence was called, the entire base seemed to pause with it. Even the wind stilled. For several long seconds, there was only the sound of distant waves against rock and the faint hum of engines far beyond the gates. Ghost did not lift his paw this time. He did not need to. His presence was enough. After the silence, the formation dismissed quietly. Marines returned to their units. Orders resumed. The world kept turning beneath the wide California sky. Ghost rose and walked beside his handler toward the training field, gravel crunching beneath boots and paws. The young corporal reached down briefly and brushed his hand along Ghost's shoulder, not as reassurance, but as acknowledgement. Ahead of them, recruits waited for instruction, their faces expectant, their uniforms crisp. Ghost stepped into position without hesitation. The command was given. He moved forward with purpose, focused and precise, every motion guided by the discipline that had shaped him from the beginning. The past did not weigh him down. It steadied him. As the sun climbed higher and the Pacific shimmered in the distance, Ghost paused at the edge of the field and glanced once toward the horizon. It stretched wide and endless, unchanged and unwavering. Then he turned back to the task before him, stride firm, eyes clear. Some bonds are not broken by absence. They are carried forward in the quiet way a soldier stands watch, in the steady rhythm of steps that continue long after the final salute has been given.